My dad ordered me to show up at my sister's wedding or lose my college money. They never expected I had already graduated Chapter 1 in my class and was earning more than both of them on that wedding day. For most of my life, my sister was the plan, and I was the backup plan for the backup plan. That isn't self-pity talking. It was just an observable fact about how our house ran, the way you'd notice which room got the good light bulbs and which room got whatever was left in the drawer. When my sister decided in her sophomore year of college that art history wasn't for her after all, my dad drove up that same weekend, sat with her in the registrar's office, and paid the change of major fee along with a full extra semester so she wouldn't lose her housing deposit. When I told him 2 years later that my computer science program required a laptop capable of running the software we'd be using, he told me to look into financial aid and see what the school could do for me. Not in a cruel way, in an almost administrative way, like he was quoting a policy that existed somewhere above both of us, and neither of us had the standing to argue with it. My mother's version of the same instinct was softer, but just as consistent. She kept a folder, an actual physical folder, of my sister's report cards, recital programs, and later, wedding magazine clippings. I don't think she was hiding anything by not keeping one for me. I think it genuinely did not occur to her that there was anything in my life worth putting in a folder. When I made the honor roll, she said, "That's wonderful, honey," in the same tone she used for the weather. When my sister made the honor roll, there was a dinner out. I want to be fair here because it would be easy to make this sound like my sister was some calculating villain from an early age, and she wasn't. She was just a person who grew up believing correctly, based on all available evidence, that things generally worked out for her because people made sure they did. She didn't ask for the tutoring, the car at 18, the internship her college roommate's father arranged with one phone call. She just accepted it the way you accept sunlight, without wondering whether the person next to you was standing in shade. My dad had a way of talking about money that I've only been able to name as an adult. He kept what I think of now as a mental ledger. Not malicious, not even entirely conscious, just a running tally of what he had given each of us, updated constantly, referenced whenever he needed leverage. My line item, as far as I could tell, had exactly one entry on it for most of my adult life: tuition. He brought it up with a specificity that suggested he checked the number often. Not the exact dollar figure, but close enough that I sometimes wondered if he had it written down somewhere, the way other men keep track of a golf handicap. He brought it up always, right before he needed something from me. I noticed this pattern early, though it took me years to name it precisely. There was a particular cadence to it, a small pause before the word tuition, as if he were checking a figure in his head before saying it out loud, and then a slight change in tone afterward, the tone of a man who believed he'd just closed an argument before it had even opened. I stopped arguing with that tone by the time I was in high school. It never seemed worth the energy, and there was always a wedding cake tasting, a dress fitting, a school fundraiser for my sister that needed my attendance more urgently than my own opinion needed voicing. There's a particular memory I keep coming back to, from when I was maybe 11. My sister had a piano recital, one of those strip mall studio recitals where every kid gets a certificate regardless of how many notes they miss, and my dad took the afternoon off work to be there. I had a science fair project due the same week, a genuinely good one, a working model of a water filtration system that I'd built out of 2-liter bottles and gravel I'd collected myself from the creek behind our subdivision. I asked if he could look at it before I turned it in. He said he would later, after the recital, once things calmed down. Things never really calmed down. There was always a recital, a costume that needed altering, a ride somewhere that only he could provide because my mother didn't like driving after dark. By the time my science fair project was due, he had seen it exactly once, for maybe 90 seconds, standing in the kitchen with his coat still on. I got second place in my division. Nobody in my family asked what first place had done differently. I'm not telling you this because I think it makes me special or unusually hard done by. I've heard enough stories from enough people to know that some version of this happens in a lot of houses, and plenty of people have it worse. I'm telling you because it explains something about how I turned out, which is that I stopped waiting for anyone to notice things on their own. If I wanted something, I learned to go get it myself, quietly, without making it anyone else's problem, because making it someone else's problem had a track record of not working. So that's what I did. I chased every scholarship I was even marginally eligible for, filled out the forms myself at the kitchen table while my parents watched television in the next room, worked 2 summers at a hardware store to build up savings before I'd even applied to schools. My sister, meanwhile, spent her summers as what my dad called an intern, and what was, as far as I could tell, mostly unpaid social time at a friend of the family's marketing firm, 3 days a week, with plenty of long lunches. None of this is meant as an accusation. My sister isn't a bad person. She's actually fairly easy to get along with, in the specific way that people are easy to get along with when the world has rarely told them no. What I'm describing is a pattern, not a verdict, and patterns have a way of running quietly in the background of a family for years without anyone naming them out loud. There's another memory that fits alongside the science fair one, from a little later, my sophomore year of high school. I'd been accepted into a summer program at a state university, a genuinely competitive one, the kind that looked good on a college application and cost almost nothing beyond the bus fare to get there. My dad drove me to the bus station the morning I left, and on the drive he spent most of the time on the phone with a client, gesturing at me with 2 fingers when it was time to get out, mouthing good luck around the receiver. When I came home 3 weeks later, having made the top presentation group out of nearly 60 students, I mentioned it at dinner. My dad asked, not unkindly, whether the program would look good enough to justify the 2 nights he'd have to take off work for my sister's homecoming preparations that fall. I said I didn't know. Nobody asked me anything else about the program after that. Ours ran quietly enough that by the time I left for college, I had stopped expecting my parents to track the difference. I had also, without entirely meaning to, stopped needing them to. My sister got engaged the spring after I started my junior year, and from that point forward, the ledger stopped being background noise and became the only subject anyone in my family knew how to talk about. Sunday dinners, which used to be a fairly low-stakes hour of eating and half-watching whatever game was on, turned into planning sessions with color-coded printouts. Every phone call from my mother opened with a vendor update before it opened with hello. Did I know that the venue required a deposit by Friday? Did I have an opinion about round tables versus long tables? A question I had never once had an opinion about in my life. I want to be clear that I didn't resent the wedding itself or even the excitement around it. What started to wear on me was the assumption, never stated outright but present in every conversation, that my presence at every single planning event was not a request but a baseline expectation. The same way showing up for Thanksgiving was a baseline expectation, except now there seemed to be a Thanksgiving every other weekend for over a year. It was around this time, at one of the smaller family gatherings before the engagement party itself, that my mother mentioned in passing that my aunt, her younger sister, had just started a new job at the state university a couple of hours from where we lived, something in financial services, processing accounts for the registrar's office. Nobody paid it much attention. My aunt herself barely mentioned it beyond saying the commute wasn't bad and the people were nice. It was the kind of detail that exists in every family conversation, mentioned once and then absorbed into the general noise of who was doing what, filed away without anyone realizing it might matter later. I was, at the time, in the middle of my own quiet unraveling of a different kind, the good kind, the kind nobody in my family had any reason to notice because nobody was asking. I had picked up an extra course load the previous 2 semesters, mostly out of restlessness more than ambition, and my advisor had pointed out almost offhandedly that if I kept up the pace, I could finish my degree requirements a full semester ahead of schedule. I hadn't told my parents this, not because it was some closely guarded secret, but because the opportunities to tell them kept getting swallowed by seating chart discussions and vendor deposits, and after enough of those, you stop reaching for the opening. The wedding, as far as my family was concerned, was the only real event happening in any of our lives that year. Every gathering, no matter how unrelated to the wedding on paper, found its way back to it within 20 minutes. A cousin's graduation dinner became a discussion of whether the graduation would conflict with the dress-fitting deadline. A holiday visit turned into an impromptu seating chart review at the dinner table, my mother's laptop propped open between the mashed potatoes and the gravy boat. I let them believe the wedding was the only real event happening, mostly because it was easier than correcting them, and partly, if I'm honest, because some part of me was curious how long they could go on believing it. Here's what my family didn't know, and what I want to lay out plainly before I get to what happened at the wedding, because the reveal only lands if you understand exactly how much they'd missed. I finished my final credits that December, a full semester earlier than the spring graduation everyone assumed I'd be walking in. I chose to participate in the smaller winter commencement ceremony rather than wait for the bigger spring one, mostly because I didn't want to make a production of something my family would likely treat as a scheduling inconvenience relative to dress fittings. My mother asked, when I mentioned I had a commencement to attend, whether it would conflict with the final venue walkthrough. It didn't, as it happened, but the fact that this was her first question told me most of what I needed to know about where the ceremony ranked in the family calendar. 2 weeks before that ceremony, I'd accepted a full-time offer from a mid-sized company I'd been quietly interviewing with since the fall, the kind of role that doesn't announce itself with much fanfare, but pays considerably better than the entry-level positions most of my classmates were describing to each other at graduation parties. I signed the offer letter at my kitchen table on a Tuesday night, alone, and didn't tell anyone beyond a short message to a friend from my program who'd been going through the same process. The starting salary, once I actually saw the number on the offer letter, was higher than what my dad made after 2 decades at the plant. I sat with that fact for a long time before I did anything else with it. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't triumph, not right away. It was something closer to grief, oddly enough. A strange, quiet grief for every time I'd wanted someone in my family to ask me a real question about my life and hadn't gotten one, now arriving at the exact moment when I finally had an answer worth asking for. There's a particular loneliness in achieving something and realizing the people who are supposed to care the most are going to find out by accident, if they find out at all. I sat with the offer letter open on my laptop for a long time that night, rereading the salary figure more times than I probably needed to, not out of vanity, but out of a kind of disbelief that this number, this specific arrangement of digits, now existed in the same world as a man who'd once told me to look into financial aid for a laptop. So I mentioned it, small, low-key, almost as an experiment. I told my mother, in a phone call that was ostensibly about bridesmaid dress alterations, that I'd finished my degree requirements requirements early and had already lined up a job. She said, "That's nice, honey," paused for exactly as long as it takes to not really process something, and then asked if I'd gotten back to the coordinator about the cake tasting yet. I said I had. We hung up a few minutes later. I remember sitting in my apartment afterward, phone still in my hand, feeling less angry than I expected to feel, and more like I'd just confirmed something I already suspected. This is the part of the story I keep having to explain to people, because on the surface it sounds like the reveal already happened right here, months before the wedding, and in a sense it did. What I didn't understand yet was that telling your family something and having your family actually register it are two entirely different events, and my family had gotten very, very good at the first one without ever managing the second. It was at the engagement party, of all places, a backyard gathering at my parents' house with maybe 40 people, string lights, a rented cocktail table setup my dad had been unreasonably proud of arranging. I'd had 2 glasses of wine and was feeling looser than usual, and when my uncle, my dad's brother, asked me the standard adult at a family party question about how school was going, I actually told him. I said I'd finished a semester early, that I'd already accepted a job, that I was doing well. I wasn't trying to make an announcement. I was just, for once, answering a question honestly instead of giving the deflecting shrug I'd trained myself into. My uncle was pleased for me, said as much, raised his glass a little, but my dad was standing close enough to hear, and what he did with the information was the part that mattered. He laughed, not unkindly exactly, and said something like, "Look at him, always so modest about his little internship things. We're proud of him," and then pivoted immediately into a story about the venue coordinator's mix-up with the seating chart. My uncle didn't correct him. I didn't correct him either, in the moment, mostly out of surprise at how smoothly the actual fact of what I'd said got folded into a version that fit what my dad had already decided was true about me. I brought it up with my mother a few days later, more directly this time, said, "I don't have an internship. I have a full-time job. I already graduated." She said, "Oh, I know, sweetie. That's what I told everyone," in a tone that suggested she genuinely believed those were the same statement. I let it go, not because I didn't care, but because I realized somewhere in that conversation that the family narrative about me wasn't actually built on a lack of information. It had been built well before the information existed, and new facts were simply getting filtered through it rather than updating it. There's one more piece I should mention here because it matters later. Around that same time, my dad had started, unprompted, sending me small amounts of money every month or two, always with a note attached, something like "for tuition" or "for whatever you need, kiddo," framed as ongoing help even though my tuition had been fully covered by scholarship since my sophomore year, and there was nothing left to help with. I never told him to stop. I'm not entirely proud of that. Part of it was inertia, not wanting another conversation that would go nowhere. But part of it, if I'm honest, was curiosity. I opened a separate savings account and put every single transfer into it, untouched, and I watched the balance grow while he kept telling anyone who'd listen that he was still helping me get on my feet. I wanted to see how long he'd keep saying it after it stopped being true. As it turned out, he'd keep saying it for a very long time, right up until the moment it would cost him the most to say it. 3 weeks before the wedding, I missed a seating chart meeting because of an actual work deadline, the kind with a client attached and consequences if it slipped. I sent my mother a message explaining, figuring it would register as the minor scheduling conflict it was. Instead, my dad called that night, and I could tell from the first half second of silence after I picked up that this wasn't going to be a short conversation. "You've been letting this family down," he said, without a hello first, without even a pause to let me say anything back. "I had a deadline," I told him. "I let Mom know. Your sister is hurt. Your mother is exhausted. Frankly, I'm getting tired of it too." He let that sit for a second, the way he always did before delivering the part of the conversation he'd clearly rehearsed. "If you can't show up and support your sister the way this family needs you to right now, we're done paying for your school." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and felt something close to laughter rise up in my chest, not because it was funny, but because of the sheer distance between what he thought he was threatening and what was actually true. Nobody in my family had asked me a real question about my job, my apartment, or my life in months. But I'd missed one meeting about round tables, and suddenly I was on the verge of some financial reckoning that didn't exist anymore, hadn't existed for the better part of a year. "Okay," I said. There was a pause on his end, long enough that I could picture him recalibrating. "Okay, I'll be there," I said, "for all of it, whatever you need." I hung up a minute later, still standing in my kitchen, and I remember smiling in a way that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with the strange clarity of watching someone pull hard on a string that had already come loose without their noticing. He believed, genuinely believed, that he still had leverage over my future. He didn't know the leverage had quietly dissolved months earlier, sitting untouched in a savings account he'd unknowingly been funding. I decided, somewhere in that same kitchen, that I would show up to everything after that, not out of fear, and not even really out of spite, though I won't pretend there wasn't some of that mixed in. I think, more than anything, I wanted to see exactly how far the story they'd built about me could stretch before it broke under its own weight. I didn't know yet that it would break in front of 200 people. I just knew I was curious enough to find out. The rehearsal dinner was held 2 nights before the wedding at a private room in a restaurant my sister's future in-laws had chosen, all dark wood and low lighting and a menu with no prices printed on it. I arrived early, at my mother's insistence, to help carry boxes of favors and table numbers in from the car, which I did did without complaint, 3 trips in the summer heat while my sister sat inside checking place cards against a list on her phone. At one point during the appetizers, her fiance's mother asked me what I did for work, a perfectly normal question at a rehearsal dinner. Before I could answer, my sister leaned over and said, with real affection in her voice, that I was still figuring things out. But he'll get there eventually, he's smart, just a late bloomer. She wasn't trying to be cruel. I want to be clear about that. She said it the way you'd describe a nice but slightly aimless family friend, with warmth and a complete absence of any real information, because as far as she knew, that description was accurate. I said nothing. I decided, somewhere in that kitchen 3 weeks earlier, that I wasn't going to correct anyone anymore in these small, private moments. Correcting people quietly had already proven itself useless. I'd tried that at the engagement party. What I wanted now, though I couldn't have articulated it that clearly at the time, was for the correction to happen somewhere the family couldn't fold it back into the story they already believed. My dad gave a short toast near the end of the dinner, mostly about how proud he was of my sister, and how grateful he was to be gaining a new son, gesturing warmly at her fiancé. Then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned me by way of a joke about how at least one of his kids knew how to find a nice, stable partner and settle down, unlike some of us who were still, he said, with a little laugh that the table joined in on, working on the basics. I smiled along with everyone else. My sister squeezed my hand under the table afterward and told me not to take it personally, that Dad just worried about me, that it came from a good place. I told her I knew. I did know, in a sense. I just also knew something she didn't, which was that the worry he was performing that night had nothing left underneath it to actually worry about, and hadn't for a long time. The morning of the wedding, I drove to the country club early, before most of the family, because my mother had asked me to confirm the delivery of the floral arrangements and sign for them if the coordinator wasn't there yet. It was the kind of task that could have been handled by literally anyone on the venue staff, but it had been assigned to me with the same tone she used for everything wedding-related that year, as though my presence had value only in its usefulness to the day's logistics. The club itself was beautiful in the specific, slightly sterile way of places built to host exactly this kind of event. Manicured lawns rolling down toward a small lake, a ballroom with floor-to-ceiling windows that the staff had already begun dressing with white fabric and strings of small lights. I signed for the flowers. I helped a florist's assistant carry 2 of the larger arrangements into the ballroom, and for a few minutes I stood alone in that huge, half-finished room, listening to the quiet clatter of place settings being arranged at empty tables, and felt something I can only describe as a strange calm. The calm of a person standing backstage before a show they already know the ending to. My mother arrived an hour later in a state of controlled panic over a delivery mix-up with the chair covers, which resolved itself within 20 minutes and was never mentioned again. My sister arrived with her bridesmaids not long after, already in her robe, already glowing with the particular kind of happiness that made it genuinely hard to hold anything against her, whatever the family dynamics around her had been for the past year. I meant it when I told her, quietly, before the photographer called for the bridal party, that she looked beautiful and that I was happy for her. That part of the day had nothing to do with anyone else's math. My dad arrived in his tux an hour before the ceremony, found me near the bar setup being tested by the staff, and clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Glad you finally came around," he said, in the same tone he'd used to compliment a coworker on finishing a project on time. I just nodded. There wasn't anything useful I could say yet, and some part of me, the part that had spent the last 3 weeks curious rather than angry, wanted to save whatever I had to say for a room with more people in it. The ceremony itself was short, and, from what I could tell, exactly what my sister had wanted. She and her fiancé wrote their own vows. Both of them cried a little, and when the officiant pronounced them married, the entire room stood and applauded in that specific, slightly relieved way that crowds do at weddings, as though a small piece of collective tension had finally been allowed to release. I clapped along with everyone else. I meant it. Cocktail hour was held on the lawn overlooking the lake, string lights already glowing faintly against the early evening sky even though the sun hadn't fully set. Waitstaff moved between clusters of guests with trays of the same past appetizers I'd helped taste test with my mother months earlier, back when she'd asked my opinion on 3 different variations of a crab cake and used none of my feedback. It was there that I first noticed my aunt, my mother's younger sister, deep in conversation with a small cluster of guests I didn't recognize, gesturing with a glass of white wine in one hand. She caught my eye at one point and gave me a small wave, the kind of easy, unbothered greeting she'd always given me, unlike most of the rest of the family, who seemed to only address me in the context of some task or comparison. I made a mental note to find her later, thank her for coming, maybe finally ask more about the job she'd mentioned only in passing months earlier. I didn't yet know how much that decision would matter. Dinner service began around 7, plated courses moving efficiently between tables under the direction of a coordinator with a headset and an expression of permanent professional calm. I sat at a table with a few cousins and their partners, made pleasant small talk about traffic and hotel rooms and whether the band would take requests, and watched my father move between tables in the particular way he did at events like this, shaking hands, accepting compliments about the venue as though he'd personally selected every tablecloth, every centerpiece, every detail my mother had actually spent a year agonizing over. My mother sat near the head table, radiant in a way I hadn't seen from her in years. The culmination of over a year of planning finally arriving in real time in front of her, and for a moment, watching her laugh at something one of the bridesmaids said, I felt something almost like tenderness toward the whole strange machinery of the day. I felt, watching all of it, a kind of patience I hadn't expected. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't rehearsing a speech in my head, not exactly, though I suppose some part of me had been rehearsing it for months without realizing it. I was simply waiting, the way you wait for weather you already know is coming, for the moment when my dad would inevitably decide the reception needed one more toast, one more chance for him to stand in front of a room and remind everyone what kind of father he'd been. I didn't have to wait very long. Biao, the band leader, announced, sometime after the plates had been cleared and before the dancing was scheduled to start, that the father of the bride had a few words. My dad stood, took the microphone from its stand near the head table, and adjusted his jacket with the small, practiced motion of a man who had clearly thought about this moment in advance. He started well enough. He talked about my sister as a little girl, about a trip they'd taken together when she was 6, about how proud he was to watch her become the woman standing at the head table that night. Several people around me got misty-eyed. I did too, honestly, for that part. Then he pivoted, the way he always did, toward the parts of the speech that were actually about him. You know, he said, looking out at the room with the easy confidence of someone who'd never once had this confidence questioned. Raising 2 kids teaches you that they don't all move at the same pace. Some kids know exactly what they want early. Others take a little longer to find their footing. He let his eyes drift toward my table, not subtly, and a few heads turned to follow his gaze. I'm proud to say I've been able to help both of mine get where they needed to go, even if one of them's still figuring out exactly where that is. A ripple of polite, indulgent laughter moved through the room. My sister, at the head table, smiled the warm, oblivious smile of someone who'd heard this framing of me her whole life and never once questioned it. I'm proud I can still help this one get on his feet, my dad said, gesturing toward me now without any real subtlety at all. Glass raised slightly in my direction. That's what family's for, right? You keep showing up for each other. A few people at my table looked over at me with the specific, gentle sympathy people offer to someone being lightly, affectionately roasted at a family event. The kind of sympathy that assumes the underlying story is true and mildly amusing rather than simply false. He held the microphone out toward me across the room, an invitation, clearly expecting nothing more than a warm, grateful nod, maybe a small joke back at his own expense to close the moment out gracefully. I stood up. I want to say I felt my pulse racing, but honestly, what I mostly felt was a kind of stillness, the particular calm of finally reaching the part of the day I'd been waiting 3 weeks for. I walked over, took the microphone from his hand, and turned to face the room. Off first, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. I want to congratulate my sister and her husband. I mean that completely. Watching you two get married today has been one of the best things I've seen all year. A warm murmur moved through the room. Nods. My sister's hand pressed briefly to her chest. I also want to thank my parents, I continued, for everything they've given me over the years. My dad's smile widened at that, comfortable, expectant, the smile of a man hearing exactly the speech he'd anticipated. It didn't last long, which is why I was a little surprised, I said, to hear tonight that they're still helping me get on my feet. A few confused smiles started to form around the room, the kind people wear when they sense a joke coming but haven't found the punchline yet. Because I actually graduated back in December, top of my class, in fact. I gestured loosely toward the hook of my own night, toward the fact my family had spent over a year not quite hearing. A full semester early, the table nearest the head table went quiet first, the way quiet spreads outward from wherever it starts. My mother's smile, I noticed, froze in place, a particular frozen quality of an expression that hasn't caught up yet to what it just heard. I signed a job offer 2 weeks before that ceremony, I went on, keeping my voice level, not performing anger, just laying facts down one at a time the way you'd set dishes on a table. And after my first full quarter there, my salary came out higher than what my dad's made after 20 years at the plant. I said it plainly. I wasn't trying to humiliate him, not exactly, though I understood, saying it, that humiliation was probably an unavoidable side effect. I was correcting a story, nothing more. A story that had been told about me in that very room not 5 minutes earlier, in front of 200 people who now knew it wasn't true. My sister's husband looked over at my dad with an expression I can only describe as recalibrating, the look of a man realizing the family he'd just married into had been quietly getting some fairly basic facts wrong for a long time. My dad opened his mouth, then closed it. For a moment, it looked like that might be the entire response the room was going to get, a silence standing in for whatever he couldn't quite assemble into words. That's when my aunt, seated 3 tables back, set down her wine glass and stood up. I hadn't planned this part. I want to be honest about that, because it would make for a cleaner story if I said I'd arranged it in advance, orchestrated the whole thing like some kind of quiet strategist. But the truth is simpler and stranger than that. My aunt stood up entirely on her own, and every head in the room, including mine, turned toward her. I don't usually talk about work at family things, she said, loud enough to carry but not shouting, the microphone still in my hand, though I hadn't offered it to her. But since we're apparently doing this tonight, I process student accounts at the university. I have for the better part of a year now. She looked at my dad, not unkindly. kindly, more like someone correcting a coworker's math in a meeting. There's been a zero balance on that account since the winter term. Full scholarship coverage, confirmed and closed out months ago. I know because I was the one who processed the closure. The silence that followed was different from the one before it, heavier somehow. The kind of silence that comes when a fact stops being one person's word against another's and becomes something closer to a verified record. A few guests near her table exchanged glances. Someone near the back, a friend of my sister's I didn't recognize, said quietly but not quietly enough, "Wait, so what has he actually been paying for?" My dad's face went through several stages in the span of about 3 seconds. Confusion, then something like calculation, then a kind of stillness that looked almost like relief at simply having nothing left to perform. My mother's face went through the same 3 stages my father's had, just a half second behind, as though she'd been watching him for cues her whole life and hadn't learned yet how to generate her own reaction to something this large. She reached over and touched his arm, and I watched her realize in real time that the folder she'd have kept for me all these years, if she'd ever thought to keep one, would have had exactly one entry too, a closed account dated months before any of us stood in this room. Nobody at the head table moved for what felt like a genuinely long stretch, though it was probably no more than 15 or 20 seconds. The band, which had been waiting in the wings for the toast to finish so they could start the first dance set, seemed to sense something was off and held their positions rather than starting up. A server carrying a tray of coffee cups paused near the edge of the room, unsure whether to keep moving through a silence that clearly wasn't hers to interrupt. My sister's future mother-in-law, seated near the head table, leaned toward the woman next to her and asked, in a whisper pitched just slightly too loud, whether this was some kind of tradition on our side of the family, a toast that turned into this. Nobody answered her. My uncle, the same one from the engagement party who'd heard the truth months earlier and watched it get folded into a story about internships, sat with his arms crossed and an expression I couldn't quite place, something between vindication and secondhand embarrassment on my father's behalf. My sister's new husband leaned toward my sister and said something too low for me to hear. She didn't look at him. She was looking at our dad, and for the first time all night, I couldn't read her expression at all. A few tables over, someone had stopped eating entirely, fork resting against the edge of a plate, watching the head table with the specific stillness of a person deciding whether it would be rude to keep chewing. Somewhere behind me, a chair scraped softly against the floor as someone shifted their weight, and the sound seemed to travel farther than it should have in a room that size. My aunt sat back down, unhurried, and picked her wine glass back up from the table as though she'd just finished pointing out a minor discrepancy in a spreadsheet rather than dismantling a story that had held this family together, or at least held its version of me together, for the better part of a year. She caught my eye for a brief second and gave me the same easy, unbothered look she'd given me during cocktail hour. Nothing performative in it, just a kind of quiet solidarity that didn't need to be announced. I set the microphone down on the table in front of my father, the same table where he'd stood a few minutes earlier holding it out to me like a gift. Nobody reached for it. Somewhere near the bar, a glass clinked against another glass, too loud in the quiet, and nobody laughed.